What would you do if, moments after taking your seat in first class, someone told you that you didn't belong there, not because of a mistake, but because of who you are? Would you stay silent, move quietly, and avoid the scene, or would you stand your ground, knowing every eye in the cabin is watching for Naomi Ellison? That question wasn't hypothetical. On Flight 212, a simple journey turned into a defining battle, one that would ignite headlines, challenge corporate culture, and force an airline to face its own hidden biases. But how did a single confrontation with a lead purser unravel into a courtroom showdown, a corporate reckoning, and a movement that reached far beyond the runway? And perhaps the biggest question, how much can one person change, simply by refusing to move? Stay with us as we step into the aisle that became a battleground for dignity and justice. If this story moves you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss the moments that matter most. Let's begin. The soft hum of the air conditioning in the Aerosky Polaris Lounge at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport blended with the muted clink of glassware and the occasional rustle of a newspaper. The place was all polished wood, leather armchairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the slow ballet of planes moving across the tarmac. People spoke in low tones, their words floating over the background music that was just loud enough to mask the business deals and personal dramas unfolding in each corner. Naomi Ellison sat by the window, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the clouds. She was 19, but the weight in her eyes made her seem older. A neat leather tote rested on her lap, the kind that had probably been her father's once, with softened edges and a faint smell of cedar. Her father had been the quiet architect of Aerosky Airlines, not the face in glossy magazines, not the man giving keynote speeches. He was the one in the hangar at 2 a.m, running his hands over a new fuselage design like it was a newborn child. 6 weeks ago, a sudden heart attack had taken him. The shock had been as violent as it was final. And now, by a twist of both love and law, Naomi found herself holding his controlling shares in the airline. That inheritance came with a seat on the board, a seat she would occupy tomorrow morning in New York. She had never imagined stepping into that world so soon. She wasn't ready, or maybe she was, but the readiness felt like a mask she had to keep on until it fused with her face. The boarding pass in her hand was for Flight 212 Seattle to New York, first class, seat 2A. That seat wasn't just a luxury. It was a connection her father had obsessed over the ergonomics of those very seats for months, tweaking angles, materials, and cushioning until he was satisfied. He used to tell her, "The seat is where a passenger spends their journey. Make it perfect, and you make their world better." She used to roll her eyes at how seriously he took it. Now, every time she saw one, it felt like a thread that still tied them together. A boarding announcement cut through her thoughts. She took a deep breath, smoothed the sleeves of her navy sweater, and rose from her seat. The tote bag felt heavier than it should have, its contents more symbolic than practical: her ID, the boarding pass, and a thick folder containing official shareholder documents and her appointment to the board. They were more than papers. They were her father's legacy and her responsibility. At Gate B7, the first-class boarding line was short a cluster of polished shoes, designer carry-ons, and expensive watches. Naomi took her place quietly, letting the others go ahead. She didn't mind boarding last. It gave her more space, fewer eyes on her, at least for a few moments. The jet bridge smelled faintly of fuel and metal. Each step forward seemed to echo in her mind. She stepped onto the plane and was greeted by a flight attendant whose posture was impeccable and whose smile was just shy of warm. Her hair was styled in a precise chignon, and her name tag read Claudia Merrick. "Welcome aboard," Claudia said, her tone professional but cool. "Thank you," Naomi replied softly, offering a polite smile as she glanced toward the cabin. Claudia's eyes flicked to Naomi's boarding pass. "May I see that?" she asked. Naomi handed it over. Claudia's gaze lingered on it a beat too long before she returned it. "Seat 2A," she said. But something in her tone, a fractional hesitation, made Naomi's chest tighten. She moved past the first row, and there it was, her seat. Beige leather, chrome trim, the kind of understated elegance that whispered instead of shouted. She reached up to stow her small carry-on in the overhead bin. "Excuse me." Claudia's voice cut through the cabin's quiet hum. Naomi turned, her hand still on the bag. "Yes," she asked. "I'll need to see your boarding pass again," Claudia said. The words were crisp, but her eyes carried a different message, one Naomi knew too well. Suspicion. Naomi hesitated. "I just showed it to you, and I need to verify it again," Claudia replied. Her hand extended, manicured fingers steady. Her voice carried enough volume to draw the attention of a man in the next row, who glanced up from his laptop. Naomi took the pass from her tote and handed it over. Claudia examined it with exaggerated care, flipping it over, scanning the name. "Naomi Ellison," she said aloud, as though tasting the syllables. She glanced at Naomi again, then at the pass. "I'll have to check with the gate agent," Claudia continued. "There seems to be a discrepancy." The word landed like a pebble in Naomi's stomach. She could feel the subtle shift in the air around her, the curiosity of nearby passengers sharpening into judgment. The man in the tailored suit behind her, seat 3A, was watching now. His expression was calm but alert. "What kind of discrepancy?" Naomi asked, keeping her voice even. "Sometimes the system issues seat assignments incorrectly," Claudia said. "We have a full manifest, and I need to ensure all first-class passengers are correctly seated. The implication was clear. You don't belong here." Claudia walked briskly toward the front, speaking into the intercom with a low voice, her back straight, her authority on display. Naomi stood there, aware of every pair of eyes on her. She could feel the familiar burn of being judged on sight, of being measured and found improbable. When Claudia returned, there was a faint, almost triumphant curve to her lips. "As I suspected. There's some confusion. Please wait here by the galley while we sort it out. May I see your identification as well?" Naomi's fingers tightened on the tote strap. This wasn't a procedural check anymore. It was something else. Something older than this plane, this airline, this day. She thought of her father, of how he'd moved through the aerospace industry with grace, even when people questioned whether he belonged. She thought of the quiet dignity he carried like armor. "There is no confusion," Naomi said, her voice steady. "My name is Naomi Ellison. My seat is 2A, and that is my valid boarding pass." Claudia's eyes hardened. "I have been doing this job for over 2 decades. She said, "I know when something isn't right." Naomi felt the heat of humiliation, but beneath it, a slow, steady current of something else began to move. Resolve. She glanced toward her seat, the seat her father had designed, the seat she had every right to occupy. And she knew this was not just about a boarding pass anymore. It was about her right to be seen and to stay. The hum of boarding continued like a soft tide. Overhead bins opened and closed with polite clicks. A child laughed somewhere behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. The smell of brewed coffee drifted forward from the galley and wrapped the cabin in a gentle warmth. Naomi stood near the galley as directed. her tote pressed against her side, listening to the tiny sounds of preparation that made flying feel like ritual. She could feel the weight of the other passengers looking without wanting to be seen looking. It was the kind of attention that lands on your skin and stays there. Claudia returned with the boarding pass in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Her smile was technically a smile. It did not reach her eyes. When she spoke, the words were chosen with care, but the music underneath them carried a colder note. "There is a possible system error," she said. "We will need an additional verification before takeoff. For now, please remain here. It will only take a moment." Naomi studied Claudia's face. No apology, no acknowledgement of the humiliation of being made to stand like a lesson in front of a dozen strangers. Naomi felt a thought rise and catch. She did not want to be the story of the girl who made a scene. She also did not want to be the story of the girl who swallowed injustice to keep everyone else comfortable. She reached into the tote and found her wallet. She kept her voice gentle. "If you need my identification, I can provide it. But I would like to sit down while we wait. My seat is 2A. Claudia lifted one eyebrow without lifting her head. "We have a full manifest. Until we clarify the seating, you will remain here." The man in 3A opened his laptop a little wider, as if to shield the conversation from his view. Then he closed it again and turned in his seat. His suit was precise, but his voice was warm. "Excuse me," he said. "I am Michael Tan. I am an attorney. I fly this route often." I was watching when Ms. Ellison first presented her boarding pass. It seemed valid. If you need a neutral witness, I'm happy to offer a statement. Naomi glanced at him. Kind eyes, steady posture, the sort of presence that suggests a person knows how to help without rushing to take over. She gave him a grateful nod. Claudia's smile thinned. "Thank you, sir. We have procedures." "Of course," Michael said. "Procedures are excellent when they are not used as weapons." The words were mild. The effect was not. A few passengers shifted in their seats. One woman stopped scrolling her phone and looked up. Naomi watched Claudia's eyes flash for a split second before the professional mask resettled like a curtain. Claudia checked the manifest again. Her voice was cool. "Ms. Ellison, I will need to see the credit card used to purchase this ticket." Naomi kept her breath slow. "The ticket was purchased by corporate account," she said. "It should be linked to the reservation. If there is an issue, your system can verify that." Claudia's chin tilted. "Our system is very robust. That is why I'm verifying. Please wait." She turned and disappeared through the forward galley curtain. The cabin exhaled a low murmur. Naomi remained still. She thought of her father standing at a drafting table and tracing the outline of a wing rib with a pencil that made a whispering sound against paper. He used to say that design is a promise. You tell people, this will hold you. This will carry you. Then you work until your promise is true. Naomi stared down the aisle to 2A. Beige leather, soft light, the promise of rest. She felt the ache of wanting to sit. More than that, she felt the ache of wanting to belong without having to prove it. Michael rose from 3A and stepped into the aisle. "May I ask a question?" he said quietly. "Do you want me to intervene more directly? Or would you prefer I stay available and silent unless things escalate?" Naomi met his eyes. "Thank you for asking. Please stay available. I want to handle this without more embarrassment for anyone." He nodded. "Understood. If at any moment you want me to speak louder, I will." A younger flight attendant peeked from the galley. He had kind eyes and a nervous energy that made him seem a little too careful with his hands. His name tag read Ethan Blake. He looked at Naomi with an uncertain sympathy and then vanished again. A moment later, another attendant emerged, Rosa Martinez. She carried a tray with water glasses that trembled only slightly with the movement of the plane at the gate. She offered Naomi a glass. "For you, ma'am," she said softly. "Thank you," Naomi said. The glass cooled her fingers. The small kindness steadied her. Claudia returned. Her heels made neat sounds against the carpet. She held the boarding pass in one hand and a tablet in the other. The tablet glowed with a passenger list. She placed both items against her hip like a shield. "According to the preliminary check, there is a mismatch with the loyalty profile for this reservation," she announced. "Until we resolve the mismatch, we cannot seat you in first class." Naomi blinked. The words sounded official, and also like they were reaching for a reason that looked better than the reason under the surface. She spoke evenly. "I do not have a loyalty profile. This ticket is a corporate issue for urgent business. That should not be a barrier." Claudia's lips curved. "Our premium cabin is reserved for certain verified profiles and for confirmed full-fare purchases. Last-minute bookings can trigger alerts. I am protecting the integrity of the cabin." Naomi felt heat in her chest. She heard her father in her memory. "When someone uses a rule to make you small, ask them which rule it is. Ask them to read it out loud." "Which rule," Naomi asked, "requires a loyalty profile for a paid seat?" Claudia's smile did not change. "I will consult with the captain." She moved toward the cockpit door. Naomi stood very still. Her heart tapped steadily against her ribs. She felt grief push up against anger like two tides meeting. She thought of the last morning with her father in the kitchen. He had brewed coffee and told her that courage is not the fire. It is the hand that carries water through the fire without spilling. Michael leaned toward the aisle. "I have a copy of the contract of carriage for Aerosky on my laptop," he said. "If needed, we can reference what it actually says about boarding rights and seat assignments." He paused. "You are doing incredibly well. Miss Ellison?" "Thank you," Naomi said. "Please call me Naomi." He smiled. "Michael, then," Naomi said, and the name settled between them like a small bridge. The cockpit door opened. Captain Edward Sloan stepped out. He wore the calm of a man who had seen storms and wanted only to outfly them. There was a tired patience in his posture. He nodded to the cabin and then to Naomi. "Ma'am," he said, "I am Captain Sloan. I understand there is an issue with your seating." "There is no issue with my seat," Naomi said softly. "There is an issue with being asked to prove I belong in it." He studied her face. He looked at Claudia. He looked at the cabin, the clock, the crew. The airplane wanted to move. Schedules wanted to be kept. But justice does not always respect timetables. He drew a breath. "We are already a few minutes behind," he said. "To avoid further delay, would you be willing to take a comfortable seat in the main cabin just for takeoff? We can sort out the fare and seating after we are airborne." The sentence was careful. It also pushed the problem away from the present and onto Naomi. She felt an old, familiar script rise. Be nice. Be flexible. Make it easy. She looked at the seat again. 2A like a quiet harbor. She remembered her father's hands on a prototype armrest. She remembered him telling her that dignity is a seat you build inside yourself. She had built that seat. She did not need permission to sit in it. "I appreciate your concern, Captain," Naomi said. "I will not move to the main cabin. My boarding pass is valid. I will be seated in 2A, and I believe we should not take off until this is resolved." Claudia made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Young lady, you are delaying a federal flight? The captain has offered a reasonable solution." "It is not reasonable," Naomi replied, "to ask me to give up my paid seat to solve a problem I did not create." She turned back to the captain. "With respect, sir, moving me would endorse discrimination as policy." Michael spoke, his voice carrying just enough to reach the row behind him. "Captain, I am a corporate attorney and a frequent flyer on this route. The purser's conduct appears inconsistent with company policy and the contract of carriage. Forcing Ms. Ellison to move will expose the airline to significant legal risk. I am willing to provide a sworn statement." A hush followed. The air seemed to press in, as if the cabin itself was listening. Captain Sloane's jaw tightened. He was a pilot, not a judge, but the responsibility was his. He turned to Claudia. "Return the passenger's boarding pass," he said. "Ms. Ellison, please take your seat. We will address any service concerns internally." Naomi did not move. Internally was a word that meant quietly and later and maybe never. She felt the moment harden into clarity. "No," she said. "Internally is not enough. It has not been enough for a very long time." Claudia folded her arms. "Exactly who do you think you are?" she asked. Naomi reached into her tote. She did not take out the shareholder documents. Not yet. She took out her phone and found a name. She had rehearsed 1,000 speeches in her head since her father died. None of them felt right. So she chose the simplest truth. She pressed call. The line rang once, twice. A voice answered. Warm. Familiar. "This is Henry Caldwell." "Hi, Henry," Naomi said. "It is Naomi Ellison. I am on Flight 212. We have a problem." The cabin fell into a silence that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. The name Henry Caldwell moved through the cabin like a ripple in still water. Anyone who had ever flown with Aerosky or worked for the company knew the name. Naomi held the phone steady in her hand. The speaker turned up just enough for her own voice to carry. Naomi Henry's tone was instantly sharper, alert. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you until tomorrow." "Are you all right?" "Are you on the plane now?" "I am," she said, keeping her voice even. "Or I am trying to be. I'm on Flight 212 in first class. Seat 2A. "Of course," Henry said. "Your father's favorite spot on his favorite route." He hesitated for a beat. "Naomi, what's going on?" Naomi glanced at Claudia, who was standing stiffly with her arms folded, the boarding pass still in her grip. "The lead purser here, Claudia Merrick, believes my seat assignment is improbable. She has implied the ticket is fraudulent and has asked me to move to economy to avoid delaying the flight." The silence on the other end lasted only a breath before Henry's voice came back, firm and cold. "Put the captain on the phone. Now." Captain Sloane looked caught between protocol and something far heavier. He stepped forward and took the phone. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Captain Edward Sloane." "Edward," Henry said, the warmth gone, replaced by a hard edge. "Do you know who you are speaking to? Do you understand who your purser has been harassing for the last 15 minutes? Sir, there's been some confusion." The captain began. "There is no confusion," Henry snapped. "The young woman you're trying to move is Naomi Ellison. She is the daughter of Dr. Leonard Ellison, co-founder of Aerosky Airlines, and as of last month, she is the largest individual shareholder in this company. She holds her father's entire founding stake. That makes her not only my guest, but technically your employer. Do you think it's wise to send your boss to the back of the plane?" The words dropped into the cabin like stones into deep water. A few passengers gasped softly. Michael Tan allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied nod. The woman across the aisle, who had earlier been whispering to her seatmate, now shifted uncomfortably and avoided Naomi's eyes. Claudia's face drained of color. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the boarding pass on the counter beside the galley. The confidence that had carried her through 20 years of controlling this cabin had cracked. Naomi reached into her tote and withdrew the thick folder she had been carrying since the lounge. She opened it slowly, deliberately, and placed the top sheet, the embossed Aerosky stock certificate, on the console of seat 2A. She didn't lift it high, didn't wave it like a flag. She let it sit there in plain view, its seal gleaming faintly under the cabin lights. Captain Sloan handed the phone back to Naomi, his expression a careful mask. Henry's voice softened again when he spoke to her. "Naomi, you sit down in your seat. This will be handled. I'll be making calls before your plane is even airborne." "Thank you." "Henry," she said. She ended the call and set her phone beside the documents. Captain Sloan turned to Claudia, his voice low but carrying. "Get your things. You're off this flight." "Captain," Claudia began, her voice suddenly fragile. "I was following procedure." "You were following your own bias," Sloan said. "And you've embarrassed this airline, delayed my flight, and disrespected one of our owners. Security will meet you at the jet bridge. Get off my plane." The walk down the aisle was long. Claudia kept her eyes forward, but Naomi could feel the heat of the stares that followed her. She imagined the lead purser had walked this aisle hundreds of times, but never like this, never stripped of authority, never without the soft armor of a smile. Naomi didn't feel victory. She felt something quieter, heavier. This wasn't how she wanted to inherit her father's legacy, but she wouldn't pretend the injustice hadn't happened. When Claudia was gone, Captain Sloan addressed the cabin. "My apologies for the delay, and especially to you, Ms. Ellison. Your treatment was unacceptable. Let's prepare for immediate departure." Naomi placed her tote in the overhead bin, slid into 2A, and fastened her seatbelt. The seat felt both familiar and strange. Rosa Martinez approached with a glass of water and a quiet smile. "We're glad to have you with us," she said. Naomi thanked her and tried to breathe into the soft rhythm of the engines spooling up. Michael Tan leaned slightly forward from 3A. "That was impressively handled, Ms. Ellison." Naomi turned just enough to meet his eyes. "Call me Naomi, and thank you for speaking up." "My pleasure," he said. "Sometimes it matters just to say, 'I saw that.'" The plane began to push back from the gate. Naomi looked out the window as the ground crew became small figures against the glow of the terminal lights. She thought about her father's belief that flying was an act of trust in people, in machines, in the systems that bound them together. That trust had been broken in this cabin tonight. And if she was going to sit on the board of this airline, she knew she couldn't let it break again. The takeoff was smooth. Naomi kept her hands folded in her lap as the city fell away beneath them. Rosa offered dinner menus, her voice careful, almost reverent. Ethan Blake brought a warm towel, his eyes flicking with a nervous kind of respect. Every gesture from the crew seemed infused with an awareness of what had just happened. Naomi wasn't sure if it made her feel seen or isolated. Halfway through the climb, Michael spoke again, his voice low so only she could hear. "You're going to have more eyes on you now. Naomi, the story will get out. Are you ready for that?" She thought about it. "I'm not sure, but I'm more sure I can't let people like Claudia decide who belongs and who doesn't." He nodded once, approvingly. "If you ever need legal counsel off the record, I'll give you my card before we land." The offer hung there, quiet but solid. Naomi nodded her thanks. As the cabin lights dimmed for the meal service, Naomi opened the folder on her lap. The documents felt less like a shield now and more like a key to a door she hadn't wanted to open yet. But life and loss had given her no choice. She touched the embossed seal again, thinking of her father's steady hands. The lesson was in her bones. Now a seat isn't just a seat. It's a statement. And you don't give it up because someone else is uncomfortable seeing you in it. The cabin settled into a strained quiet after Claudia's removal. It was the sort of quiet that wasn't peace, but an uneasy truce, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. The air felt heavier, as though the recycled oxygen carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. Naomi sat in 2A, her tote resting at her feet, documents still on the console beside her. Her breathing had slowed, but the adrenaline hadn't left her body. She could feel it in the tips of her fingers, in the way her shoulders stayed slightly tense. Captain Sloane remained at the front of the cabin, speaking briefly into his headset. He kept glancing down the aisle as if checking that she was still there. When he finally approached, his expression was composed, but the lines around his eyes were deeper than before. "Ms. Ellison," he began, his voice pitched low enough to keep the conversation from carrying beyond the first row. "I want to address what just happened. We are trained to de-escalate situations, and in the heat of the moment, my goal was to get the aircraft moving without more confrontation. That's why I initially suggested moving you, but in hindsight, I see how that could have been the wrong call." Naomi studied him for a moment. He looked like a man who had spent his life balancing checklists, schedules, and human unpredictability. It wasn't lost on her that he'd been put in a difficult position, but she also knew that easy compromises often came at the expense of people who looked like her. "I understand wanting to keep the flight on time, Captain," she said quietly, "but moving me would have rewarded her behavior. My father always told me that shortcuts in integrity lead to long detours in trust." Sloane's gaze flickered, as if the words hit something personal. He nodded once. "I hear you. And I'll be filing a report about this incident. There will be a formal review." Naomi gave a small nod. "Thank you. I want to believe that what happened today won't happen to someone else tomorrow." Before Sloane could respond, Rosa appeared beside them with a discreet tray of champagne and still water. She offered both, her eyes warm and steady. Naomi took the water, grateful for something to anchor her hands. Rosa lingered just long enough to place a soft note on the console beside Naomi. In small, neat handwriting, it read, "I'm sorry for what happened. Not everyone here feels like she did." Naomi's throat tightened. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into the side pocket of her tote. Sometimes the quiet acts of solidarity mattered as much as the loud ones. Across the aisle, Michael was watching the exchange. He caught Naomi's eye and gave a subtle nod, as if to say, "You're not alone in this." Then he opened his laptop and began typing with quick, deliberate keystrokes. She wondered if he was already drafting his account of the incident, filing it away in case it was needed later. Meal service began, and the smells of roasted chicken and warm bread filled the air. The other passengers seemed to relax into their routines, table trays down, wine glasses filled, but Naomi could still sense the occasional glance in her direction. Some were sympathetic, others merely curious, but she let them pass over her without slowing. She tried to read, flipping open the book she'd brought, but the words blurred after a few lines. Her mind kept circling back to the moment she'd said no to moving. It had been instinct, but also something more. a line in the sand she hadn't known she was ready to draw until she was standing on it. Michael spoke again after a while, leaning slightly forward so she could hear without the whole cabin listening. "You know," he said, "what you did holding your ground, it's not just about you. Incidents like this can set precedents. The way leadership responds shapes what happens next time." "That's what scares me," Naomi admitted. "What if the precedent is that it's okay to question someone like me until they can prove themselves worthy of their seat? That's not a policy, but it's a pattern." Michael nodded. "Patterns can be harder to change than rules. But you have leverage now. Use it." The word leverage felt heavy in her mind. It wasn't a weapon she wanted to wield recklessly, but she couldn't deny the truth in his advice. Her position on the board, her stake in the company, those weren't just titles. They were tools. The question was whether she was ready to use them. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of polite exchanges with the crew, the occasional small talk with Michael, and long stretches of looking out at the vast, dark sky. The hum of the engines became a kind of background meditation. She thought of her father again, remembering nights when he'd take her out to the hangar after hours. He would point to a part of the aircraft and tell her its story, how many prototypes it had taken, what problem it solved, how many people had worked quietly to make it perfect. "People built these machines," he would say, "but trust keeps them in the air. Break that trust, and you break the whole system." When the wheels finally touched down at JFK, Naomi felt a strange combination of relief and anticipation. She had survived the flight, but she knew the real turbulence was still ahead. The incident would not stay contained in that cabin. Stories like this had a way of traveling faster than any aircraft. As the seatbelt sign turned off, a senior gate agent stepped on board and approached her row. "Ms. Ellison, Mr. Caldwell is waiting for you on the tarmac. We've arranged for a private car to take you to your hotel." Naomi gathered her tote, making sure the documents were secure. As she walked toward the exit, Michael caught her eye one last time. He slipped a business card into her hand without a word. She tucked it into her pocket, understanding it was more than just contact information. It was a promise of support. The night air on the tarmac was cool and carried the faint scent of jet fuel. A sleek black sedan idled nearby, and beside it stood Henry Caldwell. His posture was less commanding than usual. His expression weighted with concern. He stepped forward and pulled her into a brief but genuine embrace. "Naomi," he said, "I'm so sorry. I feel like I failed you and your father today." "It wasn't your fault," she replied, "but this can't happen again." "It won't," Henry said, his voice firm. "Claudia Merrick's employment was terminated before your plane even reached cruising altitude. But this is about more than one person. Tomorrow at the board meeting, we'll talk about real changes. We owe that to you. We owe it to everyone." Naomi nodded. She wasn't sure yet what those changes would look like, but she knew she'd have a say in them. For the first time since boarding the flight, she felt the tension in her shoulders ease. The sedan door opened, and as she slid inside, Naomi realized that this wasn't the end of the confrontation. It was the beginning of something bigger, something she couldn't yet see the edges of, but which she knew would demand all the calm strength she could muster. The car's ride into Manhattan was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine and the city's distant roar. Naomi sat back against the leather seat, watching the lights blur past the window. Her phone lay face down in her lap, but her mind was still in the cabin, replaying every moment from Claudia's first raised eyebrow to the stunned silence, after Henry Caldwell's voice filled the air. It was strange how the conversation with Henry had unfolded. She hadn't planned to call him. She hadn't wanted to use his authority as a shortcut. But as Claudia's interrogation stretched on, as the captain offered the easy compromise of moving her, Naomi felt the line between patience and capitulation snap. Her father had taught her that silence was not the same as peace. Some silences were just another way of letting something wrong live longer than it should. When the sedan pulled up to the Peninsula Hotel, a doorman opened her door with a warm smile and a quiet, "Good evening, Ms. Ellison." It caught her off guard. The name carried weight here, even among strangers. She offered a polite thank you and stepped inside. Her suite was immaculate, all pale marble and city skyline views, but she barely noticed. She placed her tote on the desk and sat in the chair, staring at the documents inside. Shareholder certificates, her father's signature still visible on the older ones. The appointment to the board, proof of her position, but also a symbol of the responsibility she hadn't asked for and couldn't refuse. She thought of Henry's words on the tarmac. This is about more than one person. That was true. But tomorrow, when she walked into that boardroom, the memory of what happened on Flight 212 would still be raw. Some would see her as a victim, some as trouble, and some, she suspected, would see her as a test of how far they could push the new shareholder before she pushed back. Naomi poured herself a glass of water from the minibar and stood at the window, looking down at the endless motion of the city. She could hear her father's voice again, softer now, like the memory itself was leaning in. Build things, Naomi, not just structures. Build trust. Build fairness. Build the kind of place where you'd want to belong, even if you weren't you. She had wanted to hold on to that philosophy, but tonight she'd been forced to defend her right to exist in a space that her father helped create. Now, while Claudia had been the face of the problem, Naomi knew the roots ran deeper. Her phone buzzed against the desk. Henry's name lit up the screen. She answered on the second ring. "Henry? Naomi?" he said, his tone less formal now. "I just got off the phone with legal. They're drafting a full report on the incident. Claudia's dismissal is effective immediately. But that's the easy part. The hard part is changing the culture that made her think she could act that way." "I know," Naomi replied. "Firing her won't stop the next Claudia." There was a pause. "Tomorrow, I want you to tell the board exactly what you told me about your father, about what happened, about how we can't let prejudice, subtle or not, have a place here. You have more influence than you think." "Naomi, they'll listen? Will they?" she asked quietly. "They will," Henry said, "because you're not just a shareholder. You're your father's daughter. And everyone on that board respected him, even the ones who disagreed with him. That respect will transfer to you if you demand it." She thanked him and ended the call. The words were reassuring, but they didn't quiet the restlessness in her chest. Respect earned by inheritance was fragile. It could vanish the moment she made a decision they didn't like. She would need more than her father's shadow to stand on her own. She sat back at the desk and pulled out a fresh notebook. On the first page, she wrote 3 words: Coal Legacy Initiative. Beneath it, she began to sketch ideas. Scholarships for underrepresented youth in aviation. Mentorship programs linking executives with students. Diversity metrics published annually for transparency. Her father had believed in engineering solutions. Maybe this was just another kind of engineering, designing a system that could carry people higher than they thought they could go. The next morning, Naomi woke before her alarm. She dressed in a tailored Navy suit that had been a gift from her father for her high school graduation. "You'll need it someday," he had said. She hadn't thought someday would come so soon. At the Aerosky headquarters in Midtown, The security guard greeted her by name and escorted her to the top floor. The boardroom was exactly what she'd imagined: long mahogany table, high-back chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city feel like part of the meeting. Henry was already there, speaking quietly with two other board members. When Naomi entered, all conversation stopped. Heads turned. Some faces smiled warmly. Others looked neutral, unreadable, and a few wore the faintest trace of the same skepticism she'd seen in Claudia's eyes. Henry stood. "Naomi, welcome." She took the seat marked with her father's brass nameplate, the letters catching the morning light. Her fingers traced the edges for just a second before she looked up, meeting the gaze of every person in the room. Henry opened the meeting with the formal agenda, but it was clear everyone was waiting for the moment they could address what had happened. "Before we get to quarterly earnings," he said, "we need to address a failure that occurred yesterday on Flight 212. Naomi, I'd like you to speak first." Naomi inhaled slowly. "Yesterday, on the way here, I was told my seat in first class was improbable. I was asked, in front of the cabin, to prove I belonged there. When I refused to move to economy, the assumption of fraud turned into open challenge. The person who did this is gone from the company, but if we stop there, we will have fixed nothing." The room was silent. My father believed that Aerosky should be known for excellence in every aspect, including how we treat every passenger. That means building a culture where respect isn't conditional, where belonging doesn't have to be proven at the gate. She opened the notebook and slid copies of her proposal across the table. The Cole Legacy Initiative would create a scholarship fund for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation, engineering, and management. Every executive would mentor a student. We would track and publish our progress, and we would commit to making the faces in our cockpits, our corporate offices, and this boardroom reflect the diversity of the world we serve. Martin Greaves, a man with silver hair and a reputation for resisting change, leaned back in his chair. "It's ambitious," he said, his voice careful but costly. Naomi met his gaze. So is losing public trust. So is paying settlements when discrimination goes unchecked. The question isn't whether we can afford to do this. It's whether we can afford not to. Henry's mouth curved in a small, proud smile. Around the table, heads began to nod. Naomi could feel momentum building not just because of her father's name, but because the truth of what she was saying was hard to deny. She sat back, letting the silence fill the space where resistance might have been. For the first time since boarding Flight 212, she felt the balance tip in her favor, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been told, in ways big or small, that they didn't belong. The boardroom discussion stretched on for hours, moving from Naomi's proposal to the logistics of implementing it. Some members raised concerns about budget, about whether the program could scale. Others were already imagining the press release, the positive coverage. Naomi kept her focus steady, answering questions without letting emotion tip her voice too far in either direction. This wasn't about winning an argument in the room. It was about building something that would last long after the moment had passed. By the end of the meeting, the board voted unanimously to adopt the Cole Legacy Initiative. Henry confirmed that an initial $15 million would be allocated to seed the scholarship fund and mentorship program. Naomi felt a small current of satisfaction, but she knew this was only the foundation. The culture shift she envisioned would take years. People didn't change because of a single meeting. They changed because the system around them gave them no choice. As the members filed out, Martin Greaves lingered. His expression was thoughtful rather than combative. "Your father was a stubborn man," he said quietly. You've got that same streak. If you can keep it pointed in the right direction, you'll do some good here." It wasn't praise exactly, but Naomi accepted it as a kind of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Mr. Greaves." That night, back in her hotel suite, Naomi finally allowed herself to exhale. She sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city breathe below. The events of the past 24 hours played in her mind: Claudia's voice, the captain's compromise, Henry's thunder over the phone, and beneath it all, the way her father's presence seemed to move invisibly through each decision she made. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, the voice was clipped and unfamiliar. "Ms. Ellison, this is Kurt Denver. I represent Claudia Merrick. My client intends to pursue a wrongful termination suit against Aerosky Airlines, and possibly against you personally." Naomi sat straighter. "Against me?" "Yes," Denver said. "We believe your actions and influence directly resulted in her termination, causing significant emotional and financial harm." Naomi's first instinct was disbelief. Then she remembered something her father used to say: "When you change the order of things, the ones who benefited from the old order will fight to keep it." She realized this was exactly that fight. "Mr. Denver," she said, her voice cool, "I suggest you review the incident reports and passenger statements before assuming your client has a case. I'm confident the evidence will tell a different story." "We'll see," he replied, and hung up. Naomi stared at the phone for a moment. She wasn't angry yet, just aware that this was far from over. 2 weeks later, the lawsuit was filed. Claudia's claims were predictable. She had been following protocol. She had been unfairly targeted because Naomi wielded her shareholder status like a weapon. She had been humiliated in front of the entire cabin without cause. The filing even suggested that Naomi had fabricated parts of the encounter to strengthen her public image. The story hit the media almost immediately. Certain outlets sympathetic to Claudia's narrative framed it as a case of the powerful crushing the working class. Photos of Naomi taken without her knowledge in the airport appeared online, alongside headlines designed to provoke outrage. Social media debates ignited, and for every message of support she received, there were others accusing her of overreacting, of playing the race card, of ruining a woman's career. Naomi had expected criticism, but the relentlessness of it was something else entirely. Every time she opened her phone, there was another opinion, another judgment, from someone who hadn't been there. Henry called her into his office. "We're going to fight this," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. Inside were copies of sworn statements from multiple passengers, including Michael Tan and both Rosa and Ethan. Each account aligned almost exactly with her own. Michael's statement was the most detailed, outlining the sequence of events with the precision of an attorney. "He's offered to testify if it comes to that," Henry added. "I'm grateful," Naomi said, "but I'm not just worried about the court case. I'm worried about the court of public opinion." Henry leaned back. "Then maybe it's time you spoke there too." Naomi considered it. She had been careful not to give interviews, thinking it would only inflame things. But Claudia had no such hesitation. She was appearing on talk shows, repeating her version of events with teary-eyed conviction. She'd even launched an online fundraiser that had already pulled in tens of thousands of dollars from supporters convinced she'd been wronged. Naomi's instinct was to meet facts with facts, but she knew the public wasn't always moved by logic. They were moved by story. If she wanted to change minds, she'd have to tell hers. She reached out to a journalist she trusted, someone her father had worked with during a previous Aerosky project. They agreed to meet in a quiet cafe away from the business districts, over coffee. Naomi recounted the events from her perspective, not as a corporate shareholder, but as a passenger, as a daughter carrying her father's legacy to her first board meeting. The resulting article was measured, factual, and deeply human. It didn't demonize Claudia. It simply made the truth clear. The piece also included direct excerpts from Michael's statement and Rosa's quiet note of apology. Within hours of its publication, the tone of the online conversation began to shift. Hashtags supporting Naomi started to appear. Some of Claudia's donors began asking for refunds. Still, Naomi knew this wasn't victory. It was just another turn in a long fight. One evening, a week after the article ran, Naomi received a call from Michael. "I've been watching this unfold," he said, "and I think it's time we take this further. Claudia's lawsuit is built on a public narrative that's crumbling. If Aerosky countersues for defamation, you can not only clear your name, but make it harder for the next person to weaponize a lie like this." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "I don't want revenge." "This isn't revenge," Michael said. "It's accountability. It's ensuring the record stays straight. For you and for the people who supported you." She agreed to discuss it with Henry and the company's legal team. By the time they met, Aerosky's lawyers had already begun drafting the counterclaim. It would be a clear, documented case, false statements, damage to reputation, financial harm caused by the spread of deliberate misinformation. That night, Naomi walked through the city alone, letting the noise and motion of New York swirl around her. She thought about Claudia, about how quickly the authority she had built over 2 decades had been dismantled by one decision, one moment where her bias overrode her judgment. Naomi didn't feel satisfaction in that. She felt something closer to resolve. Actions had consequences, and pretending otherwise only delayed the inevitable. She stopped at a crosswalk, looking up at the skyline. In less than a month, she had been tested in ways she hadn't imagined, and she knew more was coming. But she also knew that she wouldn't let anyone write her story for her. Not in the boardroom, not in the cabin of a plane, not anywhere. The counterclaim filing sent a tremor through the media cycle. For days, Naomi's phone lit up with calls from reporters, legal analysts, and friends she hadn't heard from in years. Some wanted to offer support. Others wanted quotes. And a few simply wanted to hear her voice to decide for themselves whether she was the person Claudia described on talk shows. Henry kept her insulated from most of the chaos. The company's PR team handled statements, carefully releasing only verified facts and steering clear of the emotional bait that had fueled Claudia's narrative. Still, Naomi could feel the attention pressing in. Every move she made, every expression caught on camera as she walked to or from Aerosky's headquarters was dissected online. One evening, while reviewing documents in her office, Rosa Martinez called. Naomi recognized the name instantly and answered without hesitation. "Ms. Ellison, it's Rosa. I just wanted to say thank you for standing your ground that day, and for not letting what Claudia did fade into the background." Naomi leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth in Rosa's voice settle over her. "You didn't have to call me, Rosa, but I'm glad you did. I've seen things in this job," Rosa continued, hesitating. "Comments, little acts, times when passengers were treated differently for reasons that had nothing to do with their ticket or their behavior. I stayed quiet too often. But when you stood there in the aisle and refused to move, I realized silence isn't neutral." Naomi felt a lump in her throat. "It's never neutral," she said softly. "It's just permission." Rosa exhaled. "Well, I'm not staying quiet anymore. And if you need me to testify or speak to anyone, I'm here." They ended the call with a mutual sense of gratitude. Naomi sat in the quiet of her office for a long time after, realizing that while the public battle was loud and messy, the private ones, those happening in people's hearts, were where real change began. The next morning, Henry brought new developments. Claudia's lawyer has requested a mediation meeting. I think they're starting to see where this is headed. Naomi set down her coffee. Does that mean she's backing down? Not exactly, Henry said, but it means she knows she can't win in court. My guess is they'll try to negotiate a settlement to make this go away quietly. Naomi considered this. Quiet isn't what I'm after. Henry, if we settle quietly, the only lesson learned is that bad behavior can be bought out of sight. Henry nodded slowly. Then what do you want? I want transparency, Naomi said. I want people to see that there are consequences, not just for Claudia, but for the culture that enabled her for years. Henry studied her for a moment. That's a harder road. I know, she replied, but the right one usually is. The mediation meeting was set for the following week. It was held in a neutral conference space, the kind with bland carpeting and windows that looked out over nothing in particular. Naomi arrived with Henry and Aerosky's lead counsel. On the other side of the table sat Claudia, her attorney Kurt Denver, and a PR consultant who looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate catalog. Claudia avoided Naomi's eyes. Her posture was defensive, chin tilted up, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Kurt opened the discussion with practiced calm. My client is willing to drop her wrongful termination suit if Aerosky agrees to withdraw its counterclaim and issue a joint statement indicating that the situation was a misunderstanding. Naomi's lawyer spoke before she could. That's not happening. Naomi leaned forward slightly. Mr. Denver, you've read the statements from witnesses. You've seen the company's internal reports. There was no misunderstanding. There was a pattern, and it ended because someone finally said no. Claudia's lips tightened. You humiliated me in front of the entire cabin. You humiliated yourself, Naomi replied, her voice steady but edged with steel. I didn't ask you to treat me differently because of my name. I asked you to treat me the same as anyone else with a paid ticket. That should have been the easiest thing in the world to do. The room went quiet. Henry didn't speak. Neither did the attorneys for several long seconds. Finally, Kurt cleared his throat. Then it seems we're at an impasse. The meeting ended without agreement. But as Naomi left the building, she felt lighter. She hadn't come to make a deal. She'd come to make it clear that some things weren't negotiable. Later that day, she met Michael Tan for coffee near Bryant Park. He was still tracking the case in his own quiet way, feeding information to legal contacts and making sure the story stayed rooted in facts. She's not going to back down gracefully, Michael said after they'd settled in with their drinks. People rarely do when they've built their identity around being right, even when they're wrong. Naomi stirred her tea, watching the leaves swirl. This isn't about changing her mind. It's about showing everyone watching that the company won't hide behind closed doors when it comes to discrimination. Michael smiled faintly. That's why I keep telling people you're dangerous in the best way. They spoke for another hour, moving between legal strategy and lighter topics. It was the first conversation Naomi had had in weeks that felt both purposeful and genuinely human. By the time she returned to her hotel, an email from Henry was waiting. The subject line read, "Full board support confirmed." Inside was a simple message. "We're with you, all the way to the end." Naomi closed her laptop and stood by the window again. Below, the city pulsed with life strangers moving in every direction, each carrying their own unseen battles. She thought about the quiet strength it took to keep walking forward when someone tried to push you back. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. but tonight. She let herself believe that forward was still possible. The winter sun hung low over Manhattan the morning Naomi walked back into the Aerosky headquarters. A cold wind swept down the avenue, pressing her coat tighter to her frame. She carried no tote today, just a slim leather folder with notes and copies of the latest press coverage. Inside the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected a composed young woman, but Naomi could feel the undercurrent of tension humming beneath her steady exterior. Henry was already in the boardroom when she arrived. He stood near the windows, speaking quietly to two directors. Both men gave her polite nods as she set her folder down at her place, her father's old seat. The brass nameplate still read Leonard Ellison. She had not yet decided whether she wanted her own name engraved there. Today's agenda was different. The board was not meeting to discuss profits or fleet expansion. They were here to confront the reputational storms swirling around the company. Claudia's lawsuit, the counterclaim. The media frenzy had become a conversation far larger than one flight attendant and one passenger. The public wanted to know what Aerosky stood for, and so did some of its own people. When the meeting began, Henry addressed the room. "We have an opportunity here," he said, "to be transparent, to act decisively, and to show that our values are more than just words on a website." His tone was firm, but Naomi could hear the weight of experience in it. He had weathered many crises, but this one struck closer to the core of the company's identity. Naomi listened as directors took turns speaking. Some supported the Coal Legacy Initiative wholeheartedly, seeing it as a way to turn the negative press into a genuine commitment. Others, like Martin Greaves, were more cautious. "Naomi," Martin said, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, "your proposal is bold. But before we commit to such an overhaul, we have to consider the financial implications. Scholarships, mentorship programs, diversity audits. These are not one-time costs. They require sustained funding." Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "So does repairing damage to a brand's trust," she said. "And right now, our trust is on the line. Every day, this story stays alive without meaningful action. We lose more than money. We lose credibility." Across the table, another director cleared her throat. "I agree with Naomi. The numbers we're seeing from customer feedback show a dip in satisfaction tied directly to the perception that we tolerated discriminatory behavior. We can't buy that trust back with marketing campaigns." Naomi opened her folder and slid copies of a report toward the directors. "These are projections from the PR and analytics teams. The Coal Legacy Initiative isn't just about doing what's right. It's about creating measurable long-term value. A more inclusive culture means a wider talent pool, better customer loyalty, and fewer incidents like Flight 212. Martin flipped through the pages. "And you're confident this won't just be window dressing," Naomi's voice softened, but her words stayed sharp. "Window dressing is for companies that want to hide the cracks in the wall. I want to rebuild the foundation. My father designed aircraft parts that could withstand storms because he refused to compromise on materials. I'm not going to compromise on this." The room went quiet for a moment. Henry leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think that's your answer." "Martin." One by one, the other directors voiced their support. Some did it enthusiastically, others with careful qualifiers. But the direction was clear. The initiative would move forward. As the vote was recorded, Naomi felt a mixture of relief and gravity. Winning this round meant she now carried the responsibility of seeing it through. There was no longer a question of whether she belonged in this seat. The question was what she would build from it. After the meeting, Martin caught up with her in the hallway. "You argued well," he said, his tone neutral. "I still have reservations, But I respect that you're not here to simply inherit your father's place. You're here to make it your own. Thank you, Naomi said. Reservations are fine. Just don't let them become excuses. He gave a small nod before walking away. Later that afternoon, Naomi returned to her office to find Michael Tan waiting in the reception area. He had been invited to consult on the company's ethics and compliance review, and his calm presence was a welcome sight. "How did it go?" he asked as they stepped inside. "They voted yes," she said. "Now I have to make sure yes turns into something real." Michael smiled faintly. "That's the harder part." They discussed the next steps for over an hour. Timelines, partners for the scholarship program, metrics to track progress. Michael had a knack for seeing both the legal and human angles of a plan, and Naomi valued his insight. As evening approached, Naomi looked out her office window at the city lights flickering on. "Sometimes I think about that flight," she said quietly. "How close I came to just moving to economy to avoid the scene. If I had, none of this would be happening." Michael tilted his head. "And you'd be sitting here wondering why you let someone else's prejudice set your boundaries for you." She nodded. "It makes me wonder how many people have moved just to avoid the fight. How many have swallowed it down and kept going." "Too many," Michael said, "but maybe fewer after this." Naomi thought about Rose's call, about Henry's promise, about the quiet nods of support from the directors. Change wasn't instant, but it was starting. Before he left, Michael handed her an envelope. "Consider this a head start," he said. Inside was a check, a personal donation to the Cole Legacy Initiative. Naomi looked up in surprise. "Michael, it's not charity," he interrupted. "It's an investment in the kind of airline I want to keep flying with." After he left, Naomi sat for a long moment with the check in her hand. The gesture was more than financial. It was a reminder that the fight she'd been pulled into had become a choice she was making every day. She placed the check in her desk drawer, closed her folder of notes, and stood. The office was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, but before the work of rebuilding begins. She could feel the next battles on the horizon, but for tonight, she allowed herself to recognize the victory. It wasn't complete, but it was real. The interview request came on a Tuesday morning. Naomi had just finished a call with the Aerosky legal team when her assistant buzzed in. "It's Kendra Mason from Worldview News," the assistant said. "She wants to speak with you on the record. Says she's been following the case since the beginning." Naomi knew the name. Kendra wasn't one of the sensationalists chasing clicks. She was known for long-form pieces that dug deep into the people at the center of public storms. Agreeing to an interview with her would mean opening herself up, not just to questions, but to being seen in a way she couldn't control. Still, she heard her father's voice in her head. "If you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you." "Set it up," Naomi said. They met 2 days later in a quiet cafe in Soho. Kendra arrived with a worn leather notebook and an old-fashioned fountain pen. No camera crew, no assistants, just 2 women at a table by the window, steam rising from mugs of coffee. "I want to start before the flight," Kendra said. "Before the seat, before Claudia. Tell me who you were that morning." Naomi hesitated. "I was my father's daughter. I was on my way to my first board meeting as a shareholder, and I was nervous. Not because I didn't belong, but because I knew there would be people who thought I didn't." Kendra nodded, jotting notes. "And when Claudia told you to move, I felt that nervousness turn into something else. Not anger, not yet. Just a clear awareness that this was a test. If I moved without protest, she would believe she was right. and maybe others watching would too. They spoke for over an hour, covering the flight, the phone call to Henry, the board's reaction, the lawsuit, and the counterclaim. Naomi didn't embellish, didn't rehearse lines, she just told the truth as she had lived it. But when Kendra asked about Claudia personally, Naomi paused. "I don't think Claudia woke up that morning planning to humiliate me," she said finally. But she did wake up with beliefs about who belonged in that seat. Beliefs strong enough to override policy, logic, and her own self-interest. That's what has to change, not just the rule book, but the reflexes. The piece ran under the headline, "I Wasn't Moving." How one passenger turned a flight incident into a corporate reckoning. It was balanced, clear-eyed, and deeply human. The article didn't just retell the incident, it placed it in the larger context of discrimination in air travel, citing studies and previous cases within days. Aerosky's social media was flooded with messages from passengers recounting their own experiences, both good and bad. Some stories echoed Naomi's. Others described moments when crew members had gone out of their way to treat passengers with kindness and respect. The conversation had shifted from a single conflict to a broader examination of the industry. Henry called her the morning after the article went live. "You've done more for this company's credibility in one interview than we could have in 6 months of PR." He said, "You've made it about more than us, and that's the only way we win." But the praise didn't come without pushback. Claudia's lawyer released a statement accusing Naomi of waging a media campaign to prejudice public opinion. A few news outlets sympathetic to Claudia ran op-eds calling Naomi a privileged shareholder picking on an employee. Naomi didn't respond publicly to those. Instead, she kept moving forward, working with Michael and Henry on the first phase of the Cole Legacy Initiative. They began reaching out to aviation schools, youth programs, and community organizations, laying the groundwork for scholarships and internships. One afternoon, Naomi received an email from a young woman named Simone, a flight attendant based in Atlanta. Simone wrote that she had been on the verge of quitting after facing repeated microaggressions from colleagues and passengers alike. But after hearing Naomi speak in the interview, she'd decided to stay, because now she believed things could change. Naomi read the email twice before replying. She told Simone that change would take time, and that it would take people like her to keep it alive. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple exchange between two people who understood the quiet toll of being underestimated. Meanwhile, the legal battle moved forward. Discovery was underway, and Aerosky's attorneys had gathered a wealth of evidence, witness statements, internal communications, even past complaints filed against Claudia by other passengers. Naomi read through the documents one evening in her apartment, feeling the weight of patterns that had gone unchecked for years. Michael called later that night. "I've been reviewing the same files," he said. "If this goes to trial, the jury's going to see what you've seen, and they won't like it." Naomi closed the folder. Part of me hopes it doesn't come to that. Trials have a way of turning truth into theater. Sometimes theater is what it takes for people to pay attention. Michael replied. The next morning, Henry called an impromptu meeting. Claudia's team is making noise about wanting another mediation. He said, "They're feeling the pressure, but I'm not scheduling it unless you want to." Naomi thought for a moment. "Let them wait. Every day they stall. We're building something real with the initiative. That's the legacy I want, not just a settlement, but a system they can't undo." Henry smiled. "Then we keep moving." That evening, Naomi sat by her window with a cup of tea, the city lights sprawling out before her. She thought about the girl she'd been on the morning of that flight, nervous, watchful, prepared to navigate other people's doubts. She wasn't that girl anymore. She was still her father's daughter, but she was also something more. The story was no longer just about a seat in first class. It was about who had the right to sit anywhere without having to prove they belonged. And Naomi Ellison was determined to make sure no one forgot that. The invitation arrived in an envelope so thick it felt almost ceremonial. The Aerosky Annual Gala was scheduled to be held at the Grand Metropolitan, a glittering hotel in the heart of the city. Normally, the event was a celebration of profits, partnerships, and sleek marketing videos. But this year, with Naomi's name still in headlines, everyone knew the night would carry a different kind of weight. Naomi wasn't sure she wanted to go. The idea of smiling for cameras, shaking hands with investors who had probably whispered doubts about her behind closed doors, felt exhausting. But Henry called the day after she received the invitation. "You should be there," he said. "Not because you need to prove anything, but because you already have. Let them see it." So on the night of the gala, she stepped out of the car in a floor-length midnight blue gown, her hair swept into a clean knot. Photographers called her name, flashes popping in quick bursts. She kept her expression composed, offering brief smiles, but not lingering. She knew the images would be everywhere by morning, but she wanted the focus to be on the work, not the spectacle. Inside, the ballroom was a sea of polished surfaces, gold trim, mirrored walls, crystal chandeliers that caught every glimmer of light. Waiters glided between clusters of guests, balancing trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Conversations hummed, the air charged with both curiosity and speculation. Naomi made her way toward the main stage where Henry was speaking with a group of executives. Along the way, she passed Martin Greaves. He raised his glass slightly. "You clean up well," he said with a half-smile. "Thank you," Naomi replied. "I try to keep up with the board." He leaned closer. "For what it's worth, I think you've handled the last few months with more grace than most of us could have managed, even if I still think you're a little too ambitious." Naomi smiled faintly. Ambition is just persistence with better shoes. Henry's welcome speech was brief but pointed. He thanked guests for their support and acknowledged the critical conversations that had shaped Aerosky in recent months. When he introduced Naomi as a special speaker, the applause was warm but edged with curiosity. Naomi stepped up to the podium, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. She didn't look down at her notes. "Many of you know me because of a single flight," she began. "A moment when I was told to leave a seat I had paid for, in a cabin where I belonged. What happened after that moment has been dissected, debated, and written about more times than I can count. But tonight, I want to talk about what came before, and what will come after." She spoke about her father's legacy, about his belief that an airline wasn't just a business, but a bridge between people. She told them that bridges had to be built strong enough to carry everyone, not just the ones who looked a certain way or fit a certain profile. She introduced the first scholarship recipients of the Cole Legacy Initiative, showing a short video of young aviation students who would now have their education fully funded. The applause this time was louder, not just polite, but sustained. Naomi felt the tension in her chest loosen. After she left the stage, people approached her in small waves, executives offering congratulations, journalists requesting follow-ups, and a few crew members she recognized from flights. Rosa Martinez was among them. "You didn't just speak for yourself tonight," Rosa said quietly. "You spoke for every one of us who's been told to wait, to move, to not make a fuss." Naomi squeezed her hand. Then it was worth it. As the evening wore on, Naomi found herself in conversation with potential partners for the initiative. One was an aerospace engineering firm willing to fund internships. Another, a nonprofit that trained underrepresented youth for aviation careers. The momentum she had been building for months felt tangible now, almost visible in the way people leaned forward when she spoke. But there were still undercurrents. Across the room, Naomi noticed Claudia Merrick. She hadn't expected to see her here, but there she was, standing with a small group, her posture rigid. Naomi couldn't hear their conversation, but the sidelong glances told her enough. Claudia's presence was a reminder that the story wasn't finished. Later, while Naomi was speaking with a journalist, Claudia passed behind her and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Enjoy it while it lasts." Naomi didn't turn. She simply finished her sentence to the journalist and moved on. She knew a public confrontation would serve no one. Still, the words lodged in her mind. By the time the gala ended, Naomi had collected a stack of business cards and more than a few commitments for the initiative. Henry walked her to the exit. "You were right," he said. "This was your place to stand." Naomi looked back at the glittering room, now half empty, the air still humming with conversations. "It's not about the room," she said. "It's about making sure the door stays open for who comes after." Outside, the cold night air met her face. The cameras were gone now, the sidewalk quiet. She felt the kind of tired that comes after carrying something heavy a long way. But she also felt steady. Tonight had been one more step public, symbolic, but still part of a larger, slower climb. The legal fight was still ahead. The policies she wanted to change would take time. But for the first time since the flight, she allowed herself to believe that the destination was within reach. The conference room was colder than Naomi expected, the kind of chill that came not from the air conditioning, but from the atmosphere itself. A court reporter sat at one end, hands poised over a stenography machine. Across the table, Claudia Merrick sat with her attorney, Kurt Denver. Her hair was perfectly styled, her uniform replaced by a tailored gray blazer, but the familiar defiance in her eyes was unchanged. Naomi had been prepped for this. Henry and Aerosky's legal counsel had walked her through every possible question, every tactic Claudia's side might use to rattle her. Still, there was a knot low in her stomach as she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Kurt started politely enough, confirming her name, her role as a shareholder, the details of her ticket purchase. But soon his tone shifted. "Ms. Ellison," he said, "isn't it true that you could have simply moved to another available seat that day and avoided this entire situation?" Naomi kept her voice level. "It's true that I could have moved. It's also true that doing so would have signaled to everyone watching that I didn't belong in the seat I paid for. That isn't a message I'm willing to send." Kurt's lips pressed into a thin line. "You escalated the incident by calling Mr. Caldwell directly, did you not?" "I called the CEO of the company when a member of his staff attempted to override both policy and my rights as a passenger," Naomi said. "I considered that an appropriate escalation." He pressed further, asking about her media interviews, implying she had sought publicity to damage Claudia's career. Naomi answered each question calmly, grounding her responses in fact, not emotion. She could feel Claudia watching her, searching for cracks, but Naomi didn't give her any. Then came the harder questions about privilege, about her role as both a shareholder and a passenger. "Would you agree," Kurt said, "that your position gave you leverage most passengers would not have had?" Naomi didn't flinch. "Yes." and I used it to address behavior that could have happened to anyone. My position allowed me to shine a light on it. That's the point of having leverage. You use it to correct the imbalance, not ignore it." For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Even the court reporter looked up. Kurt adjusted his notes and moved on. But Naomi knew the exchange had landed. When it was Claudia's turn to be questioned, Aerosky's lead counsel wasted no time. "Ms. Merrick, can you explain why you told Ms. Ellison she needed to move seats?" Claudia straightened. "There was a passenger with specific needs. Do you have any documentation of those needs? A medical note? A pre-assigned accommodation?" "No," Claudia admitted. "And are you aware that company policy states passengers may not be relocated without cause that is documented and approved by a supervisor?" "I was the lead purser on that flight," Claudia said, her voice sharper now. "I made a judgment call. Based on what there was a pause. Based on my assessment of the situation." "Your assessment," the attorney said, leaning forward, "was that a black woman in first class did not belong there. Wasn't it?" Claudia's jaw tightened. "That's not what I said. It's what you acted on," the attorney replied. Naomi watched the exchange with a mixture of vindication and sadness. This wasn't about catching someone in a gotcha moment. It was about putting into the record what so many passengers had felt, but couldn't prove. The deposition lasted for hours. When it was finally over, Naomi stepped out into the hallway with Henry. He handed her a bottle of water. "You didn't let him corner you once," he said. "I wasn't here to win an argument," Naomi replied. "I was here to tell the truth." They rode the elevator down in silence. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk. Naomi took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. The day had been draining, but she felt a strange steadiness, too. Every step in this process, no matter how grueling, was a brick in the foundation of something bigger. That night, she called Michael. He answered on the second ring. "How bad was it?" he asked. "Not bad," she said. "Just long and cold. The kind of cold that makes you want to leave. But I stayed. Every question, every glance. It all comes down to staying." Michael was quiet for a moment. "It's not just about you staying, Naomi. It's about making sure no one else feels they have to leave." She thought about that long after the call ended. The flight had started with a single seat, but the fight had become about the invisible lines drawn in all kinds of spaces, the ones people crossed without thinking, and the ones they never dared to approach. Before bed, Naomi opened her laptop and drafted a short note to the first-class crew she'd flown with since the incident. It wasn't about the case or the headlines. It was just a thank you to the ones who had treated her, and every passenger, like they belonged exactly where they were. The next morning, she woke to a reply from Rosa Martinez. It read simply, "Some of us are still here because you stayed." Naomi smiled to herself. The trial was still ahead, the legal knot still tangled. But moments like this, quiet, unpublicized, were proof that change had already begun. The morning of the verdict. Naomi sat alone in her apartment, a mug of coffee cooling in her hands. She had declined offers to be driven to the courthouse, choosing instead to walk the few blocks herself. The city was just waking up, sunlight stretching over glass and stone, the air crisp with early spring. Inside the courthouse, the hum of conversation died down as the bailiff called the court to order. The jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. Naomi sat at the plaintiff's table between Aerosky's lead counsel and Henry, her heart steady, but her mind sharp. This was the moment months of depositions, testimony, and evidence had been building toward. The judge's voice was calm as she read the findings. The jury found that Claudia Merrick had engaged in discriminatory conduct in violation of both company policy and federal anti-discrimination laws. They awarded Naomi nominal damages. She had never sought money, but also mandated that AeroSky implement the full coal legacy initiative as part of the resolution. The verdict was binding. There was a pause after the words were read, as if the room needed a moment to absorb them. Naomi felt a rush of relief, not because she had won, but because the outcome required real, enforceable change. Claudia's attorney asked for time to review, but the judge shook her head. The jury has spoken. The order stands. Claudia sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on a point far beyond the room. Naomi didn't look at her with triumph or pity, just acknowledgement. What had happened couldn't be undone, but what happened next could be different. Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with reporters. Microphones were thrust forward, questions flying in every direction. Naomi held up a hand and spoke clearly. This was never about one seat on one flight. It was about whether we accept a culture where someone can be told they don't belong because of how they look. Today's verdict says we don't. But this isn't the end. It's the beginning of the work to make sure that truth is lived out every day. Henry took a few questions about how the initiative would roll out. He confirmed funding for scholarships, mandatory bias training for all crew, and a new passenger rights policy posted in every cabin. But most eyes stayed on Naomi. She knew they wanted more drama, a soundbite sharp enough to slice through the noise. Instead, she gave them the same steady truth she had carried from that first day in the aisle of Flight 212. That afternoon, back at AeroSky headquarters, Naomi met with the team responsible for launching the initiative. Michael was there, along with Rosa, who had flown in from her current route. A map on the wall showed the cities where outreach programs would begin. We're starting in Atlanta, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Michael said, these hubs have the highest traffic and the greatest opportunity for immediate impact. Rosa grinned. You've basically turned first class into a front line for equality. I like it. Naomi smiled, but her focus was on the work. This only matters if it lasts longer than the headlines. We need systems, checks, and follow-through. Every promise we make has to be one we keep. For the next few hours, they mapped timelines, assigned roles, and coordinated with partner organizations. It was detailed, sometimes tedious work, but Naomi welcomed it. The fight had moved from the courtroom to the conference room, and in many ways, that was exactly where she wanted it, late in the evening, after the team had dispersed. Henry lingered by the doorway. You've done something rare, he said. You took a personal slight and turned it into a corporate mandate. Most people can't do that without burning the whole place down. Naomi leaned back in her chair. The point wasn't to burn it down. The point was to make it stronger. He nodded. Your father would have been proud. After he left, Naomi sat for a moment in the quiet. The city lights glowed against the windows, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the low hum of a plane overhead. She thought about all the passengers on it, some in first class, some in coach, all headed somewhere for reasons the crew would never know. Every one of them deserved to feel they belonged there. In the weeks that followed, Naomi traveled to each of the launch cities. She met scholarship recipients, toured training sessions, and spoke at press conferences. She didn't just cut ribbons. She listened to crew members, to passengers, to community leaders who had their own stories of exclusion and resilience. One evening in Los Angeles, after a long day of meetings, Naomi boarded a late flight home. She was in 2A, a window seat in first class. A young black girl about 12 years old walked down the aisle with her mother. They stopped beside Naomi's row. checking their boarding passes. "This is us," the mother said softly, smiling at Naomi. Naomi stood to let them in. "Welcome," she said. The girl hesitated before sitting. "I saw you on the news," she whispered. "You're the reason I told my mom we should sit here." Naomi felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad you did," she said. As the plane leveled off, the city lights shrinking below, Naomi realized something important. The victory wasn't in the verdict or the policies, though those mattered. It was in moments like this, quiet, personal, almost invisible to the rest of the world. A girl choosing her seat without fear, a mother not having to second-guess if it would be worth the trouble. By the time they landed, Naomi knew the work would never truly be finished. There would always be another flight, another challenge, another invisible line to erase. But she also knew she would be there for it, not as a passenger who refused to move, but as a voice, a builder, and a keeper of the door she'd fought to open. When she stepped off the plane, she didn't look back. She didn't have to. The path behind her was clear, and the one ahead was wide open. Naomi Ellison's journey reminds us that sometimes the most powerful protests are the quietest ones. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. She turned humiliation into reform, not just for herself, but for every passenger who's ever been told, in words or in silence, that they didn't belong. The seat she refused to surrender became a symbol, the verdict a promise, and the work that followed a blueprint for change. Yet her story is also a warning. Discrimination doesn't always wear a uniform. It hides in assumptions, in glances, in the quiet calculations people make about where you belong. We can all choose to be part of dismantling that, not with grand speeches, but with daily courage, small acts of fairness, and a refusal to accept just the way it is. If Naomi's story has touched you, let it also move you to act stand for dignity, speak against prejudice, and keep the door open for those who follow. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after the last word. The next story is already boarding.